See how well you know your music from the late 70s and early 80s. I know in this crowd, it's probably better to play with music from the 50s. But let's shoot you forward. All right, so I'm going to say a few words from the lyrics, and then you see if you can fill it in or tell me what song it is. I'm not going to sing it. I'm just going to give you the lyrics. Well, the south side of Chicago is the baddest part of town, and if you go down there, Bad Leroy Brown. Very good. It's almost like a hymn sing. They're jumping in. Bad Leroy Brown. Okay, here's the other one. Because I'm bad. You know it. You know I'm bad. And this is who? Michael Jackson, right? It doesn't fit, but somehow or another he thought he was bad. And then here's this other one, for those of you a little bit more hardcore. On the day that I was born, the nurses all gathered round, and they gazed in wide wonder at the joy they had found. The head nurse spoke up, and she said, "Leave this one alone." She could tell right away that I was bad to the bone. Bad to the bone. George Thorogood. Very good. Not bad at all. So, isn't it amazing that there's infatuation with being bad? It reflects in our music. People, like, they want to be bad, and they look up to the bad. And there's something about the strength and the power of being bad. I got to tell you, I haven't been immune to it myself. There's been times when I've wanted to show how strong and muscular I am, how people don't want to mess with me, because if you do, then you regret it, just like the people who saw Leroy Brown. About 20 years ago, in the home that I had in Miami, I was in the midst of a big fight with a bougainvillea bush. You guys laugh, but those big bougainvilleas are resilient. I don't know how many times I poisoned it with gasoline, set it on fire, and it still came back. And so I decided that this bush was going to be removed because enough of our cars had suffered under its thorns. There's only so many tires that could be fixed. And so I went and I got myself a pickaxe and a shovel and a machete, and a week before that I lifted weights so I could get all ready for it. And I went to town on it. And after a while I called the kids out forward because I wanted them to be part of my triumph as I pulled out that bougainvillea and I lifted up high and I said to the kids, "Who the man? Who the man?" And I'm expecting for my kids to go ahead and give me the proper answer, and my daughter says, in her little girlish voice, "You're not the man. You're just my daddy." And she definitely put me in perspective. Definitely put in perspective. What she really wanted was just her father to hold her and comfort her and so forth, not this muscular gardener that I had turned into. Today's passage has King David, and you could tell that he must have been the man. King David must have been as bad as they come. And the Bible tells us how many warriors he was able to kill. And of course the stories must have gotten bigger, just like those fish stories. But it says that one battle he killed 22,000 warriors, and another battle 18. And so, assuming that there's a fraction of truth in that, David was a strong man. He was a warrior. He was the type of man that could flex his muscles, and he would ask, "Who the man?" People would say, "You're the man, David." All right? But little did he know that he really wasn't the man, because he didn't act like the man should. What happened, and it happens, it's a very, very human trait. After so much success, after being able to win so many battles, he pretty much thought that the world was his oyster. It was all for his taking. Anything that he wanted, he could just reach over and take it. And he saw this beautiful woman, and he said, he knew that she was married, but he says, "You know what? She's mine too." And something happens there in the psyche of his mind that he thought that he could transgress in that manner. And it gets actually pretty ugly if you think about the way that he did it, the deceitfulness and the maliciousness. And so we know that back in those days, women were treated like property. Women were owned and were displayed and dragged around like if they were truly property. And so there was a certain amount of collective objectifying of women. They were nothing but objects for the men. But David takes it further. He really just takes this sin much further. Not only did he already break the 10th commandment, and the 10 commandments were known by then already, they were displaying them. 10th commandment being, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife and all the possessions of your neighbor. But he went ahead and killed a man. He killed Uriah the Hittite, who was already a warrior, and it was a warrior with a lot of integrity who, for the sake of the battle, the bond that he had with the soldiers, he could not enjoy the comforts of home, and he did not allow himself to do that. And so David went ahead and had him killed. To unravel the sins of David is very important, because David is more than just a mythological figure. He's actually a representation of all humanity, especially the part of humanity that gets to rise into leadership and into power. The sins of David deserve and merit this deeper look, and I'm going to use a terminology that was not around in the days of David. It's actually been around, maybe 50 years, and that is the term misuse of power. David misused his power. And we know that term nowadays because a lot of people who are placed in a position of power have a certain responsibility over those that are with them. And it gets applied even to teachers. Teachers cannot misuse their power. And so I happen to have had a college professor who halfway through the semester was dismissed because it was proven that he had sexual relations with one of his students. And so back in not too long ago, university professors could not misuse their power that way, much less to speak of a high school or middle school professor. The term is used for priests. Many a priest have been excommunicated. Many a pastor have been thrown out of their church. Even presidents have been impeached for their misuse of power. But misuse of power may not apply to everybody. But it's important to go ahead and teach our children and our grandchildren the virtues that are needed so that when they rise up in their life, they might be able to use their leadership in a healthy manner. Now, David went ahead and manipulated to try to hide his sin. He brought over Uriah, and he said, okay, I'll just have Uriah come over here. He can spend some time with his wife, and then when the pregnancy comes out, it'll be attributed to Uriah. But the plan backfired. It didn't work. And so then he took it a step further, and he killed Uriah. That taking of human life so that we might satisfy ourselves is the ugliest of all human sins. And I want to point out that the prophet Nathan said some words that are very, very karmic. Karma was not part of Jewish theology. Karma is something that we're now aware of because of our multicultural and interfaith dialogues it's entered. But basically what goes around comes around. And in this biblical story, he said, because you have lived by the sword shall not leave your home. For those of you who know the stories of David, you know that later on, a few chapters later, his own son got greedy and plotted against David to overthrow him and plotted against his life. And so his son Absalom had to be put to death. And what we get from David throughout that whole narrative is his grief. How he cries over his son Absalom. It got turned into a song, has been turned into a work of literary art. O Absalom, O Absalom. Biblical words that resound. And he must have known, must have remembered the words of the prophet Nathan and how his own actions with the sword were now reflecting on the life of his own son. So let's go to the prophet Nathan. It's very important we turn to him because this is not a story only about David. It's about a prophet as well too. And this prophet had access to the royal courts and was able to speak to David and to hold him accountable. A prophet is not to be confused for a priest. Back in those days, there were temple priests, and the temple priests made sure that sacrifices were being done correctly and that all the different offerings were done in accordance to the law, and the temple priests went ahead and took care of the people and their rituals. The prophet had a different role. The prophet had to be in conversation with the king and with the royal courts. Nowadays, we don't have a prophet per se the way that we had in biblical times. There's no Nathan, there's no Jeremiah, Ezekiel, or Isaiah. But we do have modern-day prophets. The most famous one of them all, of course, was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But we've got one that's a contemporary of ours now, and that's the Reverend Dr. William Barber in North Carolina. But unlike Nathan and biblical prophets, modern-day prophets are in communication with the community, with churches. And they're working with the people and with the churches to be part of a prophetic movement. And in this prophetic movement, they're holding elected government officials in check and accountable. There's been a tension over this. The church has to have a priestly role, has to have an educational role, but it has to have a prophetic role. And some pastors are really good at having their prophetic voice, some not so much. If there's anything I learned in my years of ministry is that for the pastor to have a prophetic voice that's effective, it must be in conjunction with the church. The church must stand alongside the pastor, and they must do it together. And so consequently, the pastor as educator is very important because it requires a lot of education. It takes a lot of nurturing to go ahead and get such a collective voice moving together. And yes, the pastor may rise up like the Reverend Dr. William Barber does, or like Martin Luther King Jr. did. But for the most part today, especially in today's generation, it's almost anonymous. It's almost like a faceless movement. And a lot of people through social media, through Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, are communicating with each other to show up at different places and be part of a prophetic movement. I have to tell you that I'm quite comfortable with my prophetic voice, but I will not use it today. The events of the week, the events that have been in the news, have actually moved my heart down a different direction. And I'm moving towards the pastoral side of my role. It's very, very difficult to listen to this week and not think about the lives of the individuals that are impacted. Now, Lord knows we need a modern-day prophet. Lord knows we need to be a part of the prophetic movement. But it's very obvious to me today that the pastor is needed just as much, if not more. I'm thinking about the people who are in Charlottesville, Virginia. I'm wondering if they have a pastor, especially those individuals that succumbed to the temptation of violence. The racial tensions that are in that part of our nation are actually throughout the entire nation. But it makes me wonder if they go to church and if they have a pastor that guides them and leads them. If they have a pastor that holds them at baptism, at graduation, at marriage, at the hospital room, and even at the deathbed, and tells them that they are dearly loved. Because it is only through such holding that we get to be a part of a larger community and get to realize that our brothers and sisters, even though they may be of a different color, are still our brothers and sisters. And that such animosity and violence has no place in any community, at any manifestation, at any protest. The pastor is one who helps guide and lead the community and the church so that together they might be able to avoid such disasters. But the news of the week go beyond. The news of the week take us into a nuclear standoff. And it makes me wonder about world leaders. Do they go to church? Have they had a pastor in their life? Have these world leaders who are toying with nuclear disaster think about the consequences of all the innocent lives that might end because of their posturing and to see who is the bigger man than the other? And in this contest, to see who's got the bigger missile, all puns intended, it makes me wonder if they have a pastor in their life. Because when an individual has been raised in the church and has been held by their pastor, the sanctity of life is something that's been inculcated into them. So I got to tell you that it is my deep joy to see that this church has such a vibrant children and youth ministries, because it gives me hope that this next generation will be able to undo the wrongs that we are committing. That this next generation might be able to look at their brothers and sisters, as different as they might be, as exactly that, brothers and sisters, and treat each other with love. People who will know what it is to love thy neighbor. Not just at the individual sense, not just in the communal sense in my neighborhood, but also in the geopolitical realm. John Philip Newell, one of the pastors that I turn to, modern-day mystic and theologian, wrote, a prolific author, wrote something that I want to paraphrase at this moment. The changes moving through Western society can only be described as seismic. There are three main responses, three main reactions to these changes that are sweeping through the world like a tidal wave. The first response is to deny what is happening, to put on some blinders and to not look and to not consider the changes that are happening, and to be the ostrich with the head in the sand. The second is to frantically try to shore up the foundations of the old ways and to build up a wall against the oncoming changes. Such resistance is what's happening in our nation and throughout the world. The third, which the church invites us to, is to ask, what is it that is trying to be born that requires such changes? What is it that is trying to emerge that would require a radical reorientation of our vision? What is the new thing that is trying to break through and emerge from deep within us, from deep within our collective soul, so that this world might become a better place? Now, John Philip Newell reaches into imagery of giving birth, because it is so appropriate. When there is a pregnancy, it cannot be hidden, and we know that as it grows, it becomes evident for all to see, and that as the woman gives birth, it is a very, very painful process, but she goes through it, as painful as it is, because it is met at the end with great joy, a joy that gives the family and the community hope. John Philip Newell says that the days that we're living through are analogous to that, and that something's about to be born. Something's about to emerge, and we are in the midst of the very, very painful birth pangs of it. But how are we going to know what it is if we don't take the time to sit back and reflect on it? To take a look at the scriptures and see how is it that God is speaking to us today? How is it what we're going to know that is coming forth in this world, and how this world is going to change if we keep our head buried in the sand of social media and entertainment, and not consider being in dialogue with those brothers and sisters who might be as different as we might imagine them to be. The church, in these very, very pivotal times, has the most important responsibility of maintaining the prophetic voice, of organizing people and leading them forward with sound theology towards change that is needed, to help keep our elected leaders within a mindset of what is reasonable. But it also has the role to be the pastor, to give people the faith that they need to get through these very nervous and anxiety-producing times. That the collective angst that is running through each and every one of us as we turn on the television does not create within us a despair and a hopelessness that makes us then surrender to the violence of our times. Friends, Martin Luther the great Protestant reformer in the 16th century, described the new and emerging church as the priesthood of all believers. The priesthood of all believers means that each and every one of us is a minister. Each and every one of us is to be a pastor and help lead and guide this very broken and fractured world of ours into healing. That we're not to become passive and to just sit back and watch, but that we're to become a part of it, a part of the healing, a part of the movement, and to help keep other people in check, that when we hear somebody who may not have a pastor, who is getting into very dangerous postures, that we might take the opportunity to lead that young person or that older person into a better place. A good friend of ours, of my family, was here not too long ago to visit, and she said that she went to the Salvation Army. And that over at the Salvation Army thrift store, the attendant had a tattoo on his arm that right now I forget the exact words, but it was in reference to when he was in the military and he had to shoot down the enemy. And during times of war, that tattoo was very, very appropriate. As a soldier, it's very appropriate. But she went ahead and asked him, so now that you're no longer a soldier and you're working in the Salvation Army, how do you view this tattoo of yours? And he goes, oh, I still think is very pertinent today. And he spoke about his violent philosophy, and he spoke about his violent views on the world, and how everything was going into chaos, and he was going to be a soldier leading forward. And it made me think, does that man have a pastor? Does that individual have a church that could help him reconfigure his past, reconfigure his previous worldview into something a little bit more healthy, something a little bit less violent, something a little bit more peaceful, something a little bit more embracing of this multicultural, multi-ethnic world that we live in? As we face what might be a very difficult week, as difficult as it was last week, hopefully not more, let us consider the role of the church, and let us consider our role within the church, and how God is calling us to be a part of the solution, to be a part of the peace, to redefine the words, love thy neighbor. Because ultimately, who's the man? The man's the one who knows how to keep peace. The man's the one who knows how to love the neighbor. The man's the one who can withhold violence and extend a helping hand. Amen.